we'll shift it as we need to. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm a big believer in getting started on time. Folks will join us and catch. We're going to start with a short presentation to kind of talk about the logistics of how this process is going to work and some of the support tools that we're putting in place. And then Kate and I are going to have a discussion because we were both reading Pilgrimage at the same time about 6 years ago, and kind of culminated in a email discussion that we posted on our website. So she was generous enough to agree to do a reflective kind of discussion with me today. It is tough, I have to say, other than Richardson scholars, it's tough to find anyone who has read the whole of Pilgrimage. And so I was very grateful to be able to have that, do this teamwork with Kate. Hopefully out of this process, we can increase those numbers significantly. Which I think is a great thing. I think it's a tremendous book and woefully in need of being brought forward as one of the great works of English literature of the 20th century. So with that, I'm going to switch, if you don't mind. I'm going to share my screen here and go into a little video here, presentation. I know we all love PowerPoint so much, but it is a useful tool in its own way. And as a retired U.S. Air Force guy, it's like the only skill I got from my military time, that and wearing the uniform correctly. So welcome to everybody. We owe all of this to Kim McNeil, who kind of got this started on Twitter a few months ago. And so we're using the hashtag pilgrimage together as kind of a key. If you post to Twitter something about quote from Pilgrimage, or some reflections on Pilgrimage, and you include that hashtag, we'll be picking that up on the website that we've created to help support this process. And there is, and of course, you can follow that hashtag on Twitter pretty easily. We do have a website that has been set up to kind of support the process. Very straightforward, readingpilgrimage.com. It's not a fancy site, but we've got, so I want to walk through some of the things that we have there to help you out. And this is partly, I really believe so strongly in the value of this book. But I also recognize that there are some serious reading challenges and practical challenges in taking it on. And I want to try to help other readers through that process as much as possible. So there is a opportunity on the website to sign up to an email list. Mainly that will get you any of the regular postings to the website will be automatically emailed to you. And if you want to have discussions on the email list, that's a possibility as well. So the site starts with Start Here, which is just addressing some of the basic aspects of going through the process. The first challenge in Pilgrimage.
Sorry, Brad, are you actually sharing your screen? Because I'm not seeing it.
Oh, okay. Let me, I thought I was, but I'm not. Let's see. There we go. Okay, that will probably work a lot better.
Ah, there it is. Yeah,
there we go. Here. Okay.
Cool.
So let me just, so the website is up and running, and we'll keep it running throughout this process. We have the email list. So if you want to go to the website and sign up for email and get updates, that's available there. This talks, it gives you some tips on how to get the books, because that's one of the first challenges in getting, in reading Pilgrimage is getting a hold of it. There is actually only one complete edition available today, which is from the Virago Modern Classic series. It's all published in 4 volumes. It includes all 13 books of the novel. It's even this is a bit of a challenge. Virago, as far as I can tell, is doing these print on demand in the UK. So if you order them in other countries, you may have a wait for delivery. It doesn't look like they've got stock here in the US. But this is probably your best bet. There are a number of other editions. If you can get your hands on the Dent edition that came out in '67. It's a beautiful edition, includes all 13 volumes, but those are tough to find. And you can go chase after the individual volumes. A lot of I think the first 7 or 8 books now are in the public domain, so you can find a variety of folks who have republished them. But that information is available on the website, so you can point to, you can look there and get references on how to get a hold of the books. And this is also the basis of the schedule that Kim has proposed that we'll be following this year. So basically a book each month, with the exception of August, where we have 2 books, The Trap and Oberland. And the page numbers there are based on the pages in the Virago Modern Classics editions and the volume references as well. This is the same volume division can be found in both the Dent and the earlier Knopf editions of the books. The site will also include information about the individual books, or for each books, you'll find plot summaries, some explanatory notes, copies of contemporary reviews, and all sorts of things, annotations that can help you understand some of the references. There's also, we'll have posts about Dorothy Richardson herself, remembrances and biographical information. This is a highly autobiographical work of fiction. So understanding some of the references to Richardson's own life can be very useful in understanding the overall flow of the story and some of the references. There'll be a section on pilgrimage that talks about different critical views on pilgrimage over the years. There's a lot of scholarly work and also general criticism that has been done. When the first collection of the first 12 volumes of Pilgrimage were published in the 1930s, there was kind of a wave of articles in the mainstream media at that time. And then again in the 60s when the new edition with the 13th volume came out. And those I think are kind of interesting. So I've already posted a few of those, and we'll do that in the course of time. And then finally, a news and a discussion where we'll have announcements of events like this and forthcoming video conferences. We're planning on doing a monthly Zoom call for each book towards the end of the month. So hopefully that will give folks an opportunity to read each volume before we have the call. And I want to highlight that we've had wonderful support from the community of Richardson scholars out there. And so as you can see here, we have a number of Richardson specialists who will be joining us each month, starting with Dr. Kirsten Blumel, who has written on pilgrimage and has very recently taught Pointed Roofs, the first book, as part of a modernist class that she teaches. Next month in February, we're delighted to have Dr. Scott McCracken, who is the chief editor for the Oxford edition of Richardson. So he's guiding the whole effort, and in fact, recently published the first 2 books of Pilgrimage in the Oxford edition with annotations. And you can see, and I want to highlight in May, we have the novelist Louisa Trieger, who has written a novel about Richardson called The Lodger. If you're interested in Richardson's life, I'd highly recommend that. That focuses on Richardson's time in London, particularly when she had her affair with H.G. Wells. And I believe she's planning to have a little contest and actually give away a few copies of her book. in May. So that would be definitely worth tuning in. And we're hoping to continue this throughout the year and have participation from other Richardson experts. And I'm delighted to note that we have Dr. Becky Bowler joining us today, who will be coming back in April to talk about the tunnel. Just a few other things. If you really want to get into this as much as I do, we have, if you're very hardcore about that, it's worth seeking out the new edition. The first, it's at volume 4 because they're doing a collection of Richardson's works, complete works. But this is the first volume coming out of Pilgrimage, the first 2 books of Pilgrimage, edited by Scott McCracken. This is available from Oxford University Press. Quite expensive, but if you're really hardcore, worth looking for. 2 invaluable books, which come from the late 90s, which are annotations and kind of explanatory guides to pilgrimage done by the late George Thompson. These books are worth their weight in gold, but they're about as expensive as their weight in gold. So if you're an academic and you have access to Muse, through your institution, you can probably find an electronic version of these 2 books, and they're very, very useful. I will be cribbing for this from these 2 books generously throughout the year to help readers with some of the more cryptic aspects of the book. Likewise, if you're interested in Richardson herself, there is only really one solid biography. There's an earlier one by John Rosenberg. I wouldn't recommend as much as Gloria Fromm's book, which particularly highlights the biographical links between Richardson's life and what happens in Pilgrimage. And there is this wonderful collection of letters from Dorothy Richardson. This came out in the 90s, but it's copiously available in brand new editions, used for as little as like $15 or 10, 12 pounds in the UK. So this is, it's a huge volume, but there are wonderful letters in there. And of course, I have to mention the Richardson Society has their own website, and they post all the editions of the Richardson Journal are available on this website. I want to note one practical aspect. You will see that we reuse a lot of the photos of Dorothy Richardson in the course of tweeting and posting and things like that. Dorothy Richardson really did everything she could possibly do to make herself be essentially ignored and neglected. And among those are, there really are almost, there's really no more than a few dozen photos of Richardson that are known to exist. And virtually all of those are available online from the Richardson website. If in the course of this discussion and the reading experience you have any questions at all, there's an email that's been set up. So if you have any questions about the process, about the book, feel free to just post them there. I'll collect those, and as we have a kind of a critical mass, we'll answer them on a regular basis. And finally, I'll stop PowerPointing you to death, and we'll go into the fun part of this, which would be the discussion. Through pure coincidence, Kate and I were both living in Brussels and both reading Pilgrimage at the same time. And when I saw that her mentions of the early books on her website, I reached out to her and I said, hey, let's collaborate, because there are not many of us doing this, and we just happen to be in the same town. And so we did that. I loaned her one of the Thompson books to help out with that. And I actually, neither one of us had the 13th volume. So I got a Popular Library, and you'll have to see the volumes for the Popular Library edition of Pilgrimage. They're really choice 70s memorabilia. So we both read March Moonlight using the cheapo edition from Popular Library. which I was able to loan Kate because we were in the same town, and she gave me a nice jar of jam as a payback. So it was worth it. And then we had a dialogue at the end of that, which you can see posted on both of our sites. You can see the URLs there, and there, certainly. I would encourage you to read through them because it's, this is a book that you want to talk about. This is a book that you want to ask questions and have discussions about. And I really want to support that over the course of the next year. And so with that, let me stop this and we can now go to the fun part. Also, I just mention anybody, if you have any questions in the course of this session, just post them to the chat and we'll try to get through them in some question and action period at the end of the discussion. But with that, I wanted to open it by mentioning something that we discussed kind of as we reached the end of the pilgrimage experience, which I think is relevant to those of you who are approaching it for the first time through this activity. And that is, what exactly is pilgrimage? Because here you have this thing, it's sort of like In Search of Lost Time by Proust, because it's a multi-volume novel. But of course, it's a lot more in the sense that it's 13 volumes, over 2,000 pages in the Virago edition. It's also sort of a transitional work because it's often described as a key work of modernism, but in some ways it's not a modernist work at all. And I think that, to me, that's kind of one of the first points I think it's worth discussing because, and this is what Kate actually mentioned is, how do you approach this book as a reader? Do you read it as conventional, linear, realistic fiction, like you might read something by, say, Henry James or George Eliot? Or do you read it as a stream of consciousness type book, as you would see in Virginia Woolf's work and other more later works of modernism? So, Kate, you raised that question. How did you approach it?
I think I approached it, I just wanted to read the story. I wanted to find out what this thing was, this monument that had been so neglected. But my context was, at the time, I had been teaching English literature for about 10 years. And I was at a sort of strange point in my career. I'm now a publisher. I'm no longer a practicing academic. So my outlook was very much, I might need to teach this. I would really like to have this under my belt. So interviews for jobs and so on, I can say, well, of course, I know pilgrimage back to front and I can say this about it. So I had it in my mind as a string to my bow, a professional thing I had to know about. But I love stories, so I wanted to read it as a story. But as I got through volume after volume in order, I found that I was running up against my own expectations again and again, because the first few volumes are very Victorian at the same time as being very modernist. So I was expecting a Victorian novel by a woman who was a Victorian, published in 1915, just as I would have expected something. Oh, I don't know. I didn't actually say George Eliot, but I think you brought up Henry James. But I was thinking about Arnold Bennett and Gissing. I was comparing Richardson to Gissing and Bennett in the first instance, and in hindsight a bit to May Sinclair, but not much further than that. And then the torrent of the stream of consciousness, the complete interiority of the lead character Miriam, her vision, her experience, and the very, very tight focus on her life, that forced me away from the expectation of a Victorian novel to, oh my God, yeah, of course, we're in modernist territory. I have to think about Woolf. Blech. I don't like Virginia Woolf. But then I began to think, no, this is a soap opera. This is a very early instance of a continuing narrative of episodes in a person's life, and the audience is expected to make sense of them and draw nourishment, intellectual nourishment or whatever, possibly entertainment from them. And then there were so many other challenges thrown at the reader by Richardson that it became more of a badminton match in a way. Batting backwards and forwards, these appalling incidents in the novel in terms of story, which in terms of plot are glanced over or barely alluded to, but which the reader is expected to pick up in some strange way. It was a very combative experience. So my response to it and how I read the whole 13 volumes changed over the, 2 or 3 months that I was working through it.
Yeah. That's interesting. I just wanted to pick up on one point that you made, which is that, and this is spoiler alert, the biggest spoiler alert you can have in Pilgrimage. Richardson's mother committed suicide, and Miriam Henderson's mother commits suicide as well. I will simply mention that to say, now your test as new readers is to figure out when that happens.
And where and how.
Yes.
Because there may be 10 words directly associated with it in the entire 13 volumes. It's extraordinary. Right. You have to go back and actively dig and infer and just work the wretched fact out, because it is important.
Yeah, absolutely.
Really touched on.
Yeah. And I mean, in my case, I was reading Horace Gregory's a short book on Richardson, which is a great book, and I'll include that title on the site. And it was only his mention of that clued me in to that had happened. And I actually went back and reread it and said, oh, okay, I think I see that there, but it's glanced over so cursorily and so tangentially, and that's where, for example, reading a little bit about Richardson's life, whether you look at Fromm's book or another source, really is a useful tool, because she somewhat deliberately avoids highlighting this as, in fact, some of you may have seen very recently, there's a piece appeared in the New Yorker called The End of the Trauma Plot. And, Dorothy Richardson would have been the most vehement opponent of the trauma plot.
No wallowing in emotion. No, well, it's not that kind of emotion.
No.
Yeah.
But this highlights one of, because it is so oriented to the stream of consciousness, because this is really, 2,000 pages of life in the world as seen by Miriam Henderson, and almost exclusively by Miriam Henderson. And she's relentless and unforgiving. She doesn't believe in, I've got to provide you little clues to what's going on. And so sometimes there are passages that are quite realistic. You can see exactly what's going on. And in fact, for those books that are set primarily in London, you could practically trace her steps in some points, which is actually one of the cooler things about the book. And then in other places that you're just floating past it. And so that can be intimidating so I think this is one of the reasons I think you have to see this as a book that is sitting between kind of two eras. Richardson was only nine years older than Woolf, but she really was much more rooted in she came, Richardson, and you'll find this, I forget which book it comes up in, but Miriam Henderson loves Henry James, and particularly The Ambassadors, which is, later James is not known for its accessibility. And that kind of gives you a tip off to how James, how Richardson kind of essentially expects the reader to step up to the challenge that she puts in front of him or her.
Yeah, I'm interested that you keep referring back to Woolf. Why? Why do we have to venerate Virginia Woolf in the context of Dorothy Richardson? Why not May Sinclair? Why not Rose Macaulay? There are many, many other women writers active at this time.
But you know the answer to that. You know that the answer to that question can be found in any university library, which is when you go to the Woolf section, you know, it's 3 or 4 sections big. And Richardson's section is about as big as Pilgrimage, with Fromm's biography and maybe a couple of other critical books. I mean, it's one shelf in many cases. And the same thing with Sinclair. I mean, there has been this complete lopsided approach to the canon, if you will, of not emphasizing the other writers who were in the mix. So I'm totally on your side. I mean, I'm completely agree with that. But the fact is, for every one person who will pick up Pilgrimage, there's going to be 100 or 1,000 readers who are going to pick up one of Woolf's books and think, okay, this is emblematic of what was going on with English literature at that time.
Yeah. One of the questions I reread the things that we wrote back in 2016, preparing for this, and one of the things I wrote really struck me again, that before Richardson, who had written about a woman's life at such length and in such detail and to such exclusion of any male perspective. I truly think that Richardson was the first writer to do this, to focus on the woman's experience in the daily minutiae, the interiority, the events which are peculiarly feminine. There's nothing said about menstruation, but I bet it happens in the novels if we looked hard enough. But there's been nobody before who's done anything like this, and it is absolutely stupendous.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with that. And to me, that's one of the reasons I find this such an amazing book, is that she is so ruthlessly focused on her mindset. As one of her obituary writers wrote, it's 2,000 pages where she never for a moment concedes that there might be a male perspective on the world. But it's also at an interesting period of time, and you pointed it out, is that she came at this time where women were economically and socially the opportunities to live as a single woman were suddenly opening up in a way that weren't happening before that. And it's interesting because that is such a huge factor in this book. I mean, Miriam essentially doesn't she at the very end of the book, almost squeezed in, you have her marrying the fictional character of Alan Ottle, but up to that point, she is fiercely fixed on her own independence. And much of that, and there's so many kind of aspects of that, the bicycle, and I know Louisa Traeger seizes on this, but the independence of the bicycle woman gave a woman to go on excursions by herself and go out into the countryside. Yeah,
and to be able to go to lectures and to concerts and to choose how she wanted to spend her time and go there without escort. Right. I was very struck at the beginning of Pointed Roots. She's escorted to Germany. Well, of course, she's only 17, which I think George Thompson points out. But later, she is moving around the city just as I did in my 20s, a century later. And there's really very little difference in terms of chaperonage or how she chose to live her life.
Right.
Extraordinarily modern when you also compare this to, I don't know, let me think. People in, Anne Veronica, H.G. Wells's novel. She too was trying to move around the city in 1911, but much more restricted in where she could go, what she was allowed to do. But yet Richardson makes Miriam a far freer being. So which is the more historically accurate? Was Miriam Henderson actually true to life for a young woman of 1915, or 15 to 17, given that Richardson was writing that period about 20 years later?
Well, I mean, certainly Fromm and other scholars have identified many parallels and real life connections between what happens to Miriam and what happens to Richardson. So it does seem to be realistic. And I think one of the things that I found particularly fascinating, and to me, this is one of the reasons why I think Pilgrimage should be of interest to contemporary readers, is the extent to which her work is a big factor in the entire narrative. There's a wonderful period. I think it's a chapter in The Tunnel, which essentially follows Miriam in the course of a day in the dentist's office where she's working.
Yeah.
And as she's running upstairs and down, and she's getting the moldings from the people in the lab downstairs, and then, taking care of getting patients up and down, and then, the meals and all of that in the course of a day. And I, what novel before that devoted itself so fully to, the experience of an average day at work, even for
and a particularly, an interesting non-retail aspect of work, because young women were traditionally expected to sell goods, but to work as a dental nurse and a secretary. I do know that had been written about in novelettes in the Edwardian and early Georgian period. You got actually from late Victorian period too. You got lengthy novellas and short stories and serial novels in cheap magazines, the weekly penny papers and so on, and they would be republished as books if they'd done well enough. And I do remember reading one about a young girl who travels from Leeds or Manchester to work in a London dental surgery as a dental assistant. So there must have been something about working as a dentist that was considered maybe more respectable, maybe less risky to a girl's reputation than working in a doctor's surgery where legs might be exposed, for example, whereas teeth are far safer socially to discuss. Yes, the world of work, very rarely written about in the period in a serious professional way. Not just as a context for flirting or for romantic entanglements.
Right.
I have to interject here and say I'm very conscious of the chat, which is streaming past.
I know.
But because of my varifocals, I have to focus on the screen, and I can't see the words. It's just fuzzy grey. So I want to return to the chat at the end of this, because it all looks amazing, but I can't do both at once. Yes, the process of writing about work. I think Richardson is doing that because not only is income essential to Miriam's continued existence in London, it's essential to her freedom and her freedom of movement and so on, and self-supporting and independence. It's also a fascinating way of occupying one's time that is purposeful and is a contrast, a serious contrast to the teaching she was doing earlier in the sequence, which is about teaching younger girls and struggling with all sorts of social dynamics that are causing her great emotional problems. But the professional aspect of servicing the dental surgery and fulfilling a professional role, that's so different and so much more rewarding in many, many ways. And I wonder if that's why Richardson chose to dwell on that at such length. Because, my God, we get so little in Miriam's life that's positive and enjoyable. She's such a combative, obstreperous, fiercely resistant young woman. I really, really got to dislike her. She's not someone I would wish to spend time with. Fascinating, but good Lord, not a prickly young woman, a very prickly person.
Yeah.
Anyway, yes.
It's funny. I just literally yesterday read Lionel Trilling's essay about Pilgrimage from 1939, and boy, he did not like her in a big way.
Well, Trilling, yes.
he was, it was like could you pick a writer and a character to get up his nose in a more and he responded in a very virulent way about that.
She is not interested in being pleasing, neither author nor character, and that also is pretty revolutionary for women writers who are conditioned to be pleasing.
Well, actually, there's an interesting, I think you can find this on the Richardson Society site, because it was published in the journal, some notes from Anthony West's memories of Richardson. Anthony West being Rebecca West's Illegitimate Son by H.G. Wells. So another great writer who had an affair with Wells. And West remembers Wells making some comment to the effect that Richardson was like the most deliberately antisocial person that he had ever met. that she made no concession whatsoever to fit in with the community, or to just do the pleasant.
With what society required a woman of her age and status to behave like at that time. How strange. What an amazing woman. Fancying causing disruption socially like that. What audacity.
Right. I noticed, Rebecca, Rebecca Bowler, or Becky, you've been providing a lot of interesting commentary. Do you mind if we ask you to chime in, because it's so wonderful to have a real Richardson scholar join in and to participate in this activity, and I really want to embrace that. So please. Jump on in. You've made some excellent points here that are probably worth recapping for those who haven't been following the chat.
Real life Richardson geek from the wild.
Yay!
and brought in. I've been really enjoying this. I've just been kind of listening and nodding kind of vigorously to all of your points. I'm here kind of as a geek and as a kind of way of just having a pleasant evening, really. But there's a few things that you said. I'm just like, so because Kate, you said you couldn't remember if there was any menstruation in the novels, and there's one in Pilgrimage. So I've just kind of I need to find. So I went and got it from the Gutenberg and just kind of copied and pasted it in. But it's super coded again, Brad, like you were talking about before, where sometimes things happen. And you don't necessarily realize that something's happened. She just kind of says, she doesn't say it's a period, she says it's a group of days of pain, bewilderment and pain, her mother's constant presence, and then Eve and Sarah congratulating her, Eve stupid and laughing, the new bearing of the servants, Lilla Belton's horrible talks fading away to nothing. This kind of moment that she doesn't say what it is, so you could easily just kind of read it and just go, oh cool, she's got toothache or something.
Right. It only kind of makes bearing sense. Of the servants. Wow, so the whole household knew. Gosh, that's amazing.
Well, they're probably washing her rags, aren't they?
Right.
Yeah, that's true, and cleaning up the mess. Yeah.
So,
and would empty chamber pots. Yeah,
absolutely. They're kind of dealing with it. But I love that. I think it's just such a pilgrimage moment, that this kind of really significant life experience, this kind of transitional phase, in the ways that at least Eve and Sarah are seeing it in that way, and it's just kind of obscurely alluded to.
To evade prosecution for indecency, possibly. I don't know. It's possible.
It could be, actually. Could be. Yeah. Drew was saying, wondering if F.R. Leavis had anything to say about Richardson. I don't know the answer to that, but I'd be interested if anyone does find anything. I don't know, it's interesting, particularly male critics, that sometimes they, Ford Madox Ford, for example, said that Richardson was woefully neglected, and it was really sad that people weren't reading her work. But then you have other kind of, like Trilling, who just, she's anathema to them and their worldview. So she's very Marmite, I think, particularly for the male establishment at the time. I also remember there was an obituary, and I cannot remember who wrote it, but I could probably find out if anyone's interested. So just when she's died in the late 1930s, and this male reviewer writing the obituary says, in the whole of however many pages of Pilgrimage, there is not one single attempt to see the world from a man's point of view.
As if that's a bad thing.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I love it. I just love it so much. But yeah, there we go. That's a good example of where that goes. Yes, I agree actually with Andrew Johnson. Horace Gregory does come out very well with that.
Yeah, it's a great book. I mean, I know it's probably superficial and biased in some ways, but it is available on the Internet Archive. So if you know how to get books out of that, but you can find used copies of that, at least in the U.S., pretty cheaply. And it's only like 140 pages long, so it's a quick read. That really helped me as I was going through it. That was my first. Yeah, there you go. Great book. Thank you, Drew.
Is that something handheld or to be republishing, Brad?
That's a good question. You are a better judgment of what works for you as a publisher than I.
Because we could do it straight to print on demand, so it wouldn't the production costs would be relatively low if we didn't actually print warehouses full of the thing. But we are looking for academic related books that we can bring out that need to come out again. So if anyone's interested, tell me what would be a good pitch. Anyhow, that's the subject.
Well, I mean, what I would say is it's the kind of, to me, it reminded me of some of the books that we've seen a lot of in the last 10 years, these kind of memoirs of like, My Life in Middlemarch and, Me and Mrs. Gaskell and those sorts of things.
Gatsby,
Gregory doesn't insert himself into it, but it's just sort of like, well, if you're kind of reluctant to approach this somewhat intimidating work, he's a very welcoming guide to the process. So if you're having trepidations about undertaking pilgrimage, I think Horace Gregory's book on Richardson is terrific from that standpoint.
Okay. Andrew, I'll maybe get in touch with you after this, because it might be a good conversation to have. Because Andrew just made a comment.
Oh, okay, great. Yes. As Kate can well attest, one of the biggest things that stops publishers from reissuing neglected books is simply finding out who the hell can make an agreement regarding the rights.
Yeah. And how much is it?
Yeah.
Can we afford it?
Can they afford it? One of my favorite writers left her estate to her son, and her son left everything to the Church of Scientology. So we will never see that.
Oh dear.
God knows when that's going to see the light of day. So, other aspects about that, we've talked about the work, which is fascinating, and it's interesting that Miriam herself, I mean, she parallels Richardson's own journey. But in some ways, it's also interesting to look in terms of the transition of women and work over this period of time, because, her first jobs are, choosing from the very, very limited menu of options that were available to young women at that time. So she's a teacher, and then she's a governess. And then she goes into the office because suddenly the office work becomes available and socially respectable. But at the end of that, she becomes a writer, just as Richardson did. And it's funny to kind of contrast Miriam's experience with Woolf's, a room of one's own theory of things, because what you see from Richardson, or at least from Miriam's experiences, it's far more important to have the room than to have the 500 pounds a year,
Oh, yeah. And the door to close against the room. Although, thinking forward to when Miriam is in that bizarre relationship with Amabel, the French woman who goes off and becomes a suffragette. From my notes, I see that they were basically sharing the same space. They may have rented adjoining rooms in the attic in Mrs. Bailey's boarding house, but they were living together, doing everything together. So in that phase of her life, Miriam is really not on her own. She's welcoming someone into her space. Well, I phrase it like much like a rabbit would to a snake. There wasn't really a lot of choice, but it was, she was still there.
Yeah, but to me, that's another reason why this book should appeal to contemporary readers, because she's writing about the experience of being a roommate, and a roommate in that sort of we're sort of friends, but we're really just kind of economically working out the sharing of expenses, and all the practical aspects that go on with that are really at the part of, you know, the integral to that whole dynamic of what's going on between the two women during that period of time that they're sharing an apartment.
More
or
than
rooms.
just friends, of course, with Amabel, but I'm very aware, I don't want to kind of spoil later books in the series, but I feel like all of her living situations are complicated in that way. You know, so in Pointed Roofs, she's living in this, you know, really kind of claustrophobic, you know, hormonal atmosphere. You know, everyone's on top of each other. She's sharing a room there with Mademoiselle, right? But also, you know, every room on the corridor has got more girls in it, and they're everywhere. Similar in Backwater. Honeycomb, she's in someone else's house. You know, when she finally finds Mrs. Bailey's boarding house in London, that is just a moment of, oh, thank God. You know, she has this, and she waxes lyrical for, you know, several pages about how much this room means to her. And you know, she can hear the bells of St. Pancras, and she opens the window and she goes, oh, I'm free, and you know, it's a big deal to her. But yeah, it is, it's financial, it's, you know, there's a lot of compromises that have to be made. Everything gets, you know, it's not easy for her. And then in her later life, so, you know, Richardson's later life after Pilgrimage ends when she's married to Alan Odell, and they're dividing their times between London and Cornwall. They're doing that for economic reasons, because they can't afford London in the London season, and they can't afford Cornwall in the Cornwall season. So they are in both places at the wrong time, when it's cheaper. And then living in these tiny cottages. So everyone who goes to visit them says how small and how, you know, rickety and leaky these cottages are. And, you know, she's got a desk in one corner where she's working, or in theory working, although she's not, you know, she's being interrupted rather too much. And he's got a desk in the corner where he's working in the same room. And, you know, it just seems to be one of the curses of her life, really.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, when you read about the conditions that she and Holden lived in, I mean, they were on the bare edge of subsistence at much of the time, and really living off of the charity of particularly people like Breyer, who the writer, who became a big friend and financial supporter of the Richardsons in the last decades of Dorothy's life. So yeah, I mean, just the practical, and that's certainly one aspect that, to me, you know, why this book should be appealing to people in today's world, and particularly women in today's world, is you know, Miriam Richardson puts Miriam into so many of the practical challenges that, you know, a working woman is going to be facing even today. Getting around, having a place to live that you can afford, you know, dealing with the people that you work for. Can you stand going into work in the morning? Can you
accommodating roommates?
Accommodating roommates, getting, you know, getting around. Smoking was, you know, that was again, it's kind of like the timing of this is so wonderful, because you do see so many aspects of essentially freedom, if you will, as a broad term, that became available. So you have Miriam celebrating the experience of being able to have a cigarette in a socially acceptable, you know, way that wasn't going to get her hauled off to jail. I mean, she was going to get hauled off to jail because she wanted to be able to vote, but smoking, that was okay.
It reminded me, we're going to publish this in March. 1921, young women, single women living in London, going to parties, getting pregnant.
Yeah, right.
By a Canadian novelist. So I've just been doing the publicity for that today, which is why it's on my mind. So, oh God, yeah, Richardson, contemporary. And also thinking about leaky Cornish cottages. Rose Macaulay's Crewe Train, which I think is 1924, that fantasizes about a glorious freedom in having a leaky Cornish cottage, but instead the heroine is crammed into suburbia and maritable bliss, and a maid, and having to do the housework and dreadful things like that. But that was 10 years earlier than Richardson's actual real experience. Oh yeah, Jean Rhys, very, very, and Muriel Sparks.
Yeah,
good
right.
comparisons here.
But I mean, there's been a number there's certainly Lauren Elkin's book, Flanneuse, about women walking around the city. I know there's been a lot of that. I mean, Richardson, it's really kind of surprising that she didn't, maybe she wasn't familiar with pilgrimage at all, but walking around the city, as particularly as a single woman, is such a, you know, and seeing the lit up cafes, and you know how much your life involves going to a place for a cup of coffee or having a quick meal. That was possible, you know, but also considering the financial aspect. Can I afford to get a cup of coffee?
And also being aware that some places she still could not go. The men of her acquaintance could go to a nightclub, but she herself couldn't.
Right.
This is
I'm being angry about that.
ABC cafes, right?
Yes,
it's
and the Lions,
cafe, and it's safe, and it's and cheap. Yeah, because she goes and she just gets a roll and butter, and then either a cup of coffee or a cup of chocolate, and that's her meal.
I know. And this is not uncommon. You do read about a roll and butter being the substantial meal of the middle of the day. And you think, well, what was that bread made of? Was it proper bread, or was it that nasty flour adulterated flour and chalk?
It was aerated bread. Right?
Aerated bread.
The A in ABC was aerated bread company.
Full of air, right? Exactly. Oh, indigestible.
Yeah. But of course, you know, it's somewhat like, you know, you and I recall from Belgium that, you know, a cup of coffee gave you the right to the table.
It did, for a long time.
For a long time.
Yeah. Like J.K. Rowling having a cup of coffee and writing Harry Potter.
As some people do in Starbucks and Costas and Cafe Nero's today.
Yeah, and it just justifies your presence. Yes.
Yeah. Let's take a few minutes, if it's okay. We can open up to the rest of the folks who have joined us. We've had a great crowd of folks here, 30 plus people. If there are any questions that you want to ask, I know there's been a thread going on here in chat. But if you're any comments or questions you want to offer, let's open it up and just go off mute and chime in, please.
Well, there's a question here from Jolie saying, I've been wondering if Richardson saw Miriam as prickly, which refers to me saying that I find Miriam a very prickly character. Did Richardson herself regard Miriam as being difficult? Is there any evidence? Is Richardson recorded as writing about her own creation? I'm completely unaware of what there is.
Yeah, that's the value. Just to chime in, Becky, I'm sure knows much better than I, but Windows on Modernism is a wonderful again, Richardson didn't help herself. She, I think, destroyed a bunch of letters earlier than a certain date. So the Windows on Modernism volume is essentially from a certain point, instantly life begins, and it's reflected. So it's a lot of detail about the writing of the later volumes and the practical challenges that she was facing in just getting the words on the paper and then the papers to the publishers.
There's quite a lot on technique in there. There's quite a lot where, for example, Percy Beaumont Wadsworth, it's a mouthful, I had to slow myself down to say that, P.B. Wadsworth writes to her because he's starting to write himself, and he's got a kind of a draft of the beginning of a novel that he sent.
Are you going to the fashion district first, or are you going to
somebody better get muted.
Please make sure you're muted if you're not going to participate in the conversation.
She writes in with advice.
Where are we going to meet?
Oh, there we go. And you know, she gives him advice about, you know, at the moment you and the protagonist are trying to tell the story between you. Instead of that, you should let it come from him. It should only be what he sees. You know, avoid this impulse to kind of come in and explain or, you know, narrate yourself. Put yourself on a kind of, you know, on a back foot. you know, there's a lot of that kind of thing in her letters. She doesn't talk about Miriam as a person very much. When she does talk about characters, there's a lot of interesting stuff. So when she's talking about the teachers in Backwater and some of the school pupils in Backwater to Briar, she refers to them as their fictional names in the letters. So she says, "Oh, I saw Grace the other day, and you know, she's doing this, and she's doing that's the fictional name for the real person." So there is a sense at which, at least playfully, in letters to friends, she's, you know, just saying these are the same people. And I think her and Briar, Brad, you posted this, you know, Briar's account of meeting Richardson and what pilgrimage meant to her. And I had another read through it the other day when you posted it. Briar kind of says she was Miriam, she just is Miriam. And so there's a sense in which I think the two of them maybe have a little private joke going on where, you know, like, "Oh, Miriam, how are you?" And, you know, that's, you know. So I don't
enacting.
say, "Oh, Miriam is prickly," because then she'd have to admit that she's probably prickly herself.
Maybe. Okay.
I want to jump in because James Kelly brought up a question about clothes, and that's another big thing in this book. I mean, how much, you know, you see this early on in Pointed Roof where she's thinking about the clothes she has, and she gets a couple of blouses from her sisters and they're just not, you know, they're just too baggy to wear. And she's worried about that. Yeah. I mean, there are a number of aspects of clothes which are fascinating throughout this. I mean, there are certain themes that come back again and again. Clothes, music, books are just three that you'll see throughout this series. But clothes in particular, I found fascinating as a man that you learn so much about the practical considerations. We forget that these were clothes that people wore day in and day out. I mean, this was a day when your closet, so to speak, had 3 items in it if you were lucky, and you just wore them over and over and over and over again. And she reminds you of that. Not only that you have to make them last, but also, can I afford to get a new one or a new pair of shoes, something like that.
And you have to spend quite a lot of your evenings repairing the damage of the day and sponging off the mud. And trying, I mean, the fashions of the day, the trailing skirts, continually dragging in the mud and the horse manure and the dog manure. And then you have to wait and get home, and your room will be stinking, waiting for the stuff to dry so you can brush it clean. There's no question of washing it.
Right.
Because it would never dry in time for the next morning. The practicalities are phenomenal. Yeah. There's a question earlier about, yes, how widely read was Richardson by her contemporaries? This is from Drew Shannon. What about people like Forster, Joyce, Lawrence Sinclair, Rose Macaulay, etc.? I think we'd have to do a trawl through the biographies and the letters and the diaries of these big name authors to fish out the Richardson sightings, you might say.
I can definitely answer for Lawrence and for obviously May Sinclair. I mean, May Sinclair, you know, wrote the review of Pilgrimage in which she used the phrase "stream of consciousness," which then, you know, Richardson hated, but that became a whole thing. I mean, Richardson again, you know, she's resisting labels, which is one of the reasons why she's neglected. She's doing it willfully. And then she says, "Oh, maybe fountain of consciousness would be a better metaphor." And then she says, "Actually, no, that's crap as well." And she just keeps going. But Sinclair really admired Pilgrimage. She thought it was fantastic. She thought it was, you know, the best kind of new thing happening in fiction. And she compares it to Joyce. D.H. Lawrence did not like Pilgrimage. Again,
Kelsey, please.
Gender lines, right? He kind of just, he talks about it in the same breath as Joyce and Woolf, and I think Proust as well, at the same time. And he says, "Did I feel a twinge in my big toe, or didn't I?" says any protagonist of Joyce, Richardson, Woolf, Proust. So he's mocking that kind of the obsession with the kind of the minute feelings of everyday life, and he thinks that's, you know, but you know, he's also trying to be entertaining. So I don't know how much we take that as actual disdain.
Well, interestingly, just to add in here, she seems to have been read more by actually the generation slightly before hers than essentially a little bit after her. So, Pointed Roofs has an introduction by J.D. Beresford. He would not be considered, I think, by most people a modernist. No. Arnold Bennett read her. Those are actually the writers you see more often referring to her work.
But that's because their opinions counted. Their opinions would sell newspapers and magazines.
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
And people younger than her were nothing like as influential. And to get a Bennett review of a positive review from Bennett would be really important. He's horribly out of fashion now, but he was such an influential critic. I have a feeling Rose Macaulay reviewed one of her volumes in Time and Tide. I'd have to look it up. I'm pretty sure Time and Tide had reviews, but it would need, Kathy Clay's book would have more information about that.
Yeah, A Time and Tide, there is a project putting that online, but it's just getting started, isn't it?
Yeah, but Kathy Clay's book about Time and Tide, in fact, it's behind me. I'll just go look it up. You carry on.
Okay. Any other questions that folks or comments that folks want to chime in with? We've still got a fair number of folks hanging in. We'll be wrapping this up in a few minutes. We've gone over the hour, but you can see, I think already that this is going to be a book that we're going to want to talk about and have discussions with, which is to me a terrific to see that. So yeah, thank you, James, for joining the discussion. Becky, do you want to say anything about essentially where Richardson stands in the overall kind of focus of academic work in this era right now?
Sorry, I was typing. That's a very big question. Oh gosh. So I've just popped into the chat on the fashion question. I wrote an article about clothes in Dorothy Richardson, so just self-promoting that there in the chat. Interest in Richardson is growing, but we've been saying that for a while now. I did my PhD in just Dorothy Richardson. It was a single author PhD in 2008 to 2000 whenever that was that I finished that, 12. And the Richardson Society was just founded around about the same time. So the very first conference, which was on Pointed Roofs, because the idea at the time was that, they were going to, take each novel in turn. And then somebody said, I can't remember who it was, but somebody said, I will be dead before we get to March Moonlight if you do it like that. And I really like March Moonlight, so you're going to have to mix this up a bit. So that was very, very new then in 2008. And the Society has done a huge amount, even apart from the editions of promoting her, getting her work known. The blue plaque on Woburn Walk in London, she's just kind of about a little bit more. And just in terms of academia, I think modernist scholars now feel ashamed to admit that they haven't read Pilgrimage if they haven't.
Very good.
Yeah.
Whereas previously they would have said, "Oh, life's too short," but now they go, "Oh, I know that I should." So that it doesn't necessarily mean that they are or will be reading it, but it means that they're ashamed to admit that they haven't.
Well, I mean, there's still this practical issue. I mean, even in the UK, how many bookshops are you going to be able to walk into and find a copy of Pilgrimage?
It's not that rare. I really don't think it's that rare. And I found these in Brussels. In Brussels, I've got the 4-volume set. I've only got 2 hands, so I'm only holding up 2.
Right.
They weren't terrifically expensive, but they were there. They were available when I had it in mind. But yeah, long may the I hope the new edition comes along soon. I bring news from the field of war to say Rose Macaulay reviewed Deadlock in 1921.
Ah, okay.
In Time and Tide. This is from Kathy Clay's book, Time and Tide.
Super.
Yep. And she said she also reviewed a novel by Gerald Hopkins. I don't think Gerald Manley Hopkins, Gerald Hopkins. And she said that to turn from deadlock to the simpler narrative of Hopkins's novel is like coming up from the depths of a running stream to the surface. She's invoking May Sinclair's stream of consciousness metaphor 3 years later, which shows that it must have been pretty important in the discourse at the time, which is great. And that's one of Macaulay's earlier reviews. She didn't write, she was one of Time and Tide's first reviewers from when it began in 1920. Yeah, so she's full steam ahead there. I'm really pleased I remembered that. That's pretty good.
Yeah.
And I think we do have to note, as far as I know, the rightful inheritance or ownership of the phrase stream of consciousness goes back to William James.
Does it now?
I believe so.
Much earlier.
Suzanne Raitt in her biography of May Sinclair finds examples of the phrase in psychology all over the shop before William James. So William James is the most famous example, and so that gets repeated a lot. But I don't think he is the first person to use the phrase, but he uses it most famously. Yeah. And then May Sinclair.
Well, I mean, it's whether Richardson liked it or not, it captures a sense of what's going on in such a perfect and concise way that it does. You know, she may have not liked it, but reading Pilgrimage, you get a sense of Miriam's stream of consciousness constantly. And
you are carried along in the stream, that's all that matters. What you're passing by is irrelevant. It's the coldness and the wetness and the rocks you're flowing over. That is what the experience of reading is like.
Well, we've gone over what I was hoping to think we should hold to a time limit of an hour, but it's only because we've had a great discussion going on here. Just to recap, this will be recorded and posted on YouTube, so that we'll put the link out on the site and out on Twitter as well. And I'll try to capture the chat as well, because there's been great feedback already. Really tremendous. Good. I mean, this to me gets me really excited that we'll see where we are in December, but I'm hoping that we have a good contingent of these folks. I told Kate, if we have an apostle-sized group here in December, we'll still be doing well, you know? So thanks to everybody who joined. And again, if you have any questions that come up afterwards, please fire it off to editor@readingpilgrimage.com. And let's enjoy this pilgrimage with Dorothy and Miriam for the next year to come. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Brad and Kim, for setting this up. And Kate, this is
going to be fun.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
We'll see you in a couple of weeks with, who do we have? Oh, we have Kristen. Yes, Mike.
Professor Kristen Blumel.
Yes.
Monmouth University, New Jersey.
Terrific. Thanks very much, everybody.
Okay, bye-bye.